Welcome to New York, Lyndall Gordon from your home in Oxford, England, and to all of you listening in New York and elsewhere in the world. These virtual talks available everywhere have become one of the great boons of this pandemic period. For those tuned in from afar, I want to say that the New York Society Library is one of the most outstanding cultural institutions of New York City since the period of the American Revolution. Lyndall Gordon first came to New York from her native Cape Town, South Africa in the late 60s to attend Columbia University, where she earned her doctoral degree with a thesis on T.S. Eliot's early years that became her first book. Noticing on a university bulletin board that the Rose Trust Fellowships, hitherto only for men, was in 1973 opening to women, especially at the women's colleges of Oxford University. She gained a fellowship at St. Hilda's College, Oxford, and has been there ever since, to their great fortune. To say that Lyndall Gordon is simply a biographer does not exactly define the many prize-winning books that she has published about Mary Wollstonecraft, Henry James, Charlotte Bronte, Emily Dickinson, Virginia Woolf, and of course, T.S. Eliot. What she produces is based on these lives, but also interpreted with her extraordinary perceptions. In a sense, she is a biographer, but also an autobiographer, not only in memoirs of her own life, but in all that she writes. We learn about Lyndall Gordon through her empathy with her subjects. This is never truer than in the book about which she will speak to us today, Outsiders, the Women Writers Who Changed the World, published here by Johns Hopkins University Press. I love what she wrote at the end of her foreword. To say I chose these writers was actually wrong. They chose themselves. For each had the compulsion Jane Eyre expressed when she said, "Speak, I must." And now I give you Lyndall Gordon, who will speak to us for and about these women writers.
Across generations, gifted women calling themselves outlaw, outsider, or even, in George Eliot's phrase, failure of nature, began to emerge. They pop up one after the other. A prodigy, Mary Shelley, a visionary, Emily Bronte, an outlaw, as she called herself, George Eliot, an orator, Olive Schreiner, and an explorer, Virginia Woolf. We've long, of course, known their greatness, but by linking their lives as outsiders to their imaginative lives, I want to look at their evolving alternative to the mess that the dominant group has made of our world. This is a turn to a domestic order, a domestic history of nonviolence, nurture, and listening. At a soiree in the Strand in London, a young reformer, Bessie Parks, spotted one on the cusp of a higher order. It was Marianne Evans before she became George Eliot. She was at the time, this is 1852, she was at the time the editor of the Westminster Review. This is the first woman ever in the history of the world to edit an intellectual journal. And I wanted to mention that she was very inspired by your Margaret Fuller. It was just after Margaret Fuller's sad early death in, I think, 1850, and she read her autobiography. She was, of course, very struck by a woman who had preceded her as a literary journalist, and she was very moved by one sentence in that autobiography which spoke to her. It was about, as an intellectual, I will always hold my own, but as a single woman, the life, shall it never be sweet? That moved her very much. as a single woman herself. The date, as I said, was 1852. Evolution was in the air. As you know, Charles Darwin's Origin of Species was published in 1859. Bessie Parks, who was observing her at this particular party, said to a friend, "I think she will alter." She was speaking to another young feminist called Barbara Lee Smith, who was a cousin of Florence Nightingale and a future co-founder of Girton College for Women, the first women's Oxbridge College. And Bessie goes on, "Large angels take a long time unfolding their wings, but when they do, soar out of sight. Miss Evans either has no wings or, which I think is the case, they are budding, coming." Soon after, Marianne Evans was enthralled to come upon another of her kind, eccentric Miss Snow, in Charlotte Bronte's last novel, Villette, published in 1853. Villette, Villette, Marianne Evans murmured, thinking of the misnamed Miss Snow. What fire, what passion in her. An outsider, a lone English woman in Brussels, as Charlotte Bronte herself had been 10 years before, Lucy Snow is pressed by various people to account for her gifts of mind. "Who are you?" people ask, and she replies, "I am a rising character." The time has come to bring together the rising phenomenon of Mary Shelley, the Brontes, George Eliot, Olive Schreiner and Virginia Woolf as a rare breed. This breed was seeded by Mary Wollstonecraft, Mary Shelley's mother, who calls herself the first of a new genus. In her epoch-making book written in the context of the French Revolution, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, published in 1792, she said that women had to change before they could be worthy of rights, declaring, "I cannot tread the beaten track. It is against the bent of my nature." She believed that women had to remake themselves as authentic beings, and George Eliot concurs in her 1855 essay on Mary Wollstonecraft. When George Eliot wrote that essay, she was still Marianne Evans. She was writing at a time when Mary Wollstonecraft was in eclipse. John Stuart Mill made the same point in his treatise, The Subjection of Women, 1869, following the first attempt in the British Parliament to enfranchise women. "The nature of women," he writes, "is an eminently artificial thing." To be an outsider can facilitate authenticity, however hard it was to be what George Eliot called herself, outlaw, failure of nature, and looking back to her Maggie Tulliver youth, an unpromising woman child. How did they come to be writers despite the obstacles in women's way in the 19th century? Their lives appear changeable to the point of metamorphosis. It was improbable that Mary Godwin, at the age of 16, should have met a great poet, Shelley, keen to encourage her wish to write. It was improbable that Emily Bronte should have had two sisters of congenial genius, who contrived to publish her almost against her will. And then, too, doctors and nurses did not expect Virginia Woolf to recover from a bout of mental illness in 1915. This was the worst bout of mental illness in her life. Still less emerge in the 1920s as a leading novelist. Virginia Woolf said that she and her sister, the artist Vanessa Bell, were trained in a tea table manner, a tea table talk, that is, polite, self-effacing conversation with Victorian gentlemen who came to their house in Hyde Park Gate in Kensington in London in the 1890s. But by the end of her career, in 1938, she steps outside the silenced shade. She steps outside the silenced shade in a manner never before, and vents a volcanic voice in her feminist treatise 3 Guineas, a book so controversial that it was at first refused by bookshops, which said it was too controversial on women and unacceptable to many, even within her own Bloomsbury circle. Virginia Woolf said to one of the suffragettes, Ethel Smythe, a composer of music, she said in private that she thinks the book hit a rock of rage. This is where Virginia Woolf positions herself as what she calls an outsider and a member of the Outsiders Society. This is a secret and anonymous and hypothetical organization of women, potentially a political party with Virginia Woolf herself as leader of the opposition. Members were to work for the same aims as those of men who are brothers, that is, non-violence, non-militarization, equality. She marks the pay gap that's still an issue. But women will work separately by their own methods. Before these outsiders were writers, they were, like us, readers, and they read one another in a chain of making, a new genus of womanhood across generations. Virginia Woolf called her first and more famous feminist treatise, published in 1929, A Room of One's Own, a leap in the dark. It took a leap of the imagination to see what a woman might be. And this is echoed, or this is really, I should say, preceded by an epigraph that Olive Schreiner, very well known in her day as a leading feminist, she added this epigraph, I'm going to quote, to her feminist treatise, Woman in Labour, published in 1911. Give her the glory of going on and still to be. They are both in A Room of One's Own and Olive Schreiner in Woman in Labour are looking to what women's nature will unfold in the future. Incidentally, I should say that Olive Schreiner is actually quoting Tennyson. These 5 women I'm talking about came, saw, and left us changed, like lighthouses flashing beams to one another and to us. All take up the signal from Mary Wollstonecraft, except for Emily Bronte. There she is on the left. There were no books by women in Mr. Bronte, her father's library, but Emily Bronte did read and hear her sisters, and there they are on the right, so-called gun portrait done by their brother Branwell, who's there in the middle. On the left is Emily Bronte, in the middle is Charlotte Bronte, and to the right is Anne Bronte. She heard those vehement voices playing at authors, playing genii when they were children, and she heard Charlotte Bronte's voice through Jane Eyre. When Jane Eyre is a child and being bullied by John Reed, the spoilt son of her guardian, Mrs. Reed, Jane Eyre says to us confidentially, as we're behind her hand, "Speak, I must," as Paula very kindly quoted. And Emily Bronte also heard her sister Anne using the phrase "the world within." The world within as the inner life as different. There was a gap between the inner and the outer life. And I think that Anne used that phrase in her draft of her first novel, Agnes Grey, and Emily Bronte picks that up in one of her great poems, So Hopeless is the world without. I choose the world within. Emily Bronte was the most uncompromisingly authentic of the three sisters. And I think it is very hard to reach her. At first, although initially I put her into my proposal, I got cold feet. And I remember a discussion with my editor here in England, Lenny Goodings. I said I'd like to leave it out because I don't think there are enough biographical facts. And she said, do it. You have to do it. And I began to think that the standard way of seeing Emily Bronte really in the shadow of the men she read, Byron and Scott, wouldn't do, because one doesn't want to see her really overshadowed by those much talked about men. And it came to me that I might link her with one of Virginia Woolf's very mysterious characters, a woman called Rhoda in The Waves, who is almost faceless. Virginia Woolf calls her the nymph of the fountain, always wet. She is the woman who is a fount of fertility, of great creativity, but finds the public world almost unendurable. I think Virginia Woolf puts something of herself into this fragile figure of Rhoda, who's both fragile and very strong. And I thought that's one way to approach Emily Bronte from the inside. Her sister Charlotte described her famously, saying liberty was the breath of Emily's nostrils. On the 2nd of January, 1846, while she was writing her great novel, Wuthering Heights, her voice powered its way past her time when she wrote her poem, No Coward Soul Is Mine. And when I read Three Guineas, I found it interesting that Virginia Woolf picks up that poem and quotes two full stanzas. The context is Virginia Woolf's outrage in the late 1930s when the Anglican Church came to a decision that they would not allow women to take high office in the church, that they could climb no higher than the lowly post of deaconess. And Virginia Woolf is saying, just look, listen to this inspired voice. This is the daughter of a minister, and yet you won't have her in taking high office in the church. Virginia Woolf had a phrase, I don't know if it will jar you. She said that able women, women who were going to achieve things, were the daughters of educated men. Now, there is some truth in that. If one thinks of Jane Austen or Mary Shelley, whose father, William Godwin, was an educated man. And of course, Virginia Woolf herself, her father, was a Cambridge Don. But I don't think it's wholly true. Amongst the breed of evolving women, George Eliot was not the daughter of an educated man. He was a manager of an estate in the English Midlands. And she suffered most from miseducation at her Midland schools in the 1820s and 1830s and after. Her aspirations, and she was ambitious, was blocked by pious cant. Her teacher and later friend, Maria Lewis, pressed her to see her intellectual restlessness as failure, a failure to pray. When her intelligence rebelled against the limitations of her life as her father's housekeeper, she became her father's housekeeper at the age of 17 when her elder sister, Chrissy, married. To stir a pot of currant jelly to feed the hens and make butter was enough to set this restlessness off. We think of Jane Eyre at Thornfield, where she's a governess, when she climbs onto the roof and, as it were, looks out over the horizon. She's longing to overpass the limits of a woman's life. And she thinks to herself, women feel just as men feel. They need a field for their efforts, just as a man would. Marianne Evans, at 17, encountered an aunt, Elizabeth Evans, who was then 65, and she had defied a ban on female preachers. She had been a preacher, and this ban came in 1814. by the Methodists. She was a Methodist preacher, and she refused to stop preaching. She left her congregation in Derby, and she went elsewhere in Derbyshire to a place called Warkworth, where there was a congregation who decided they would give her, I love the phrase, full liberty of prophesying. Marianne Evans was incredibly impressed immediately by this aunt, who was a kind of model for her, dauntless woman, whose voice, Marianne Evans said, woke a spirit of love. 20 years later, when she was George Eliot, she began what she called My Aunt's Story. It was her first novel, Adam Bede, published to enormous acclaim in 1859. The pseudonym was partly because she was at that time a social outcast, and I'll explain why later. But so people were very curious who this mysterious George Eliot was. In the meantime, everybody, including Queen Victoria, was enthralled by the book. And the story really came from an incident her aunt had told her about a young woman in 1802, back long ago, who had killed her child and was going to be hanged. And this religious woman stood by her through the night before the hanging. In Adam Bede, near the start, a young woman, like her aunt, is preaching outdoors. Dinah Morris, in a plain black dress and Quaker cap, mounts a cart and speaks to country folk with, I'm quoting, feminine delicacy that touches their souls. I'm quoting now from chapter 2 of Adam Bede. There was no keenness in the eyes. They seemed rather to be shedding love than making observations. They had the liquid look which tells that the mind is full of what it has to give out, rather than impressed with external objects. She was not preaching as she heard others preach, but speaking directly from her own emotions. George Eliot tells us in her journal that she shed hot tears as she wrote this, for here was a voice she could make her own. None of the new Janus advocates social change in terms of a party manifesto. These are not ideologues. Change must rise first in the deeps of character. And that word resonates with me on this happy day with Biden elected president, because in the various appearances I've watched on British television, he does talk about the need for character, quite rightly. As readers, we experience this potency in certain books that call out our secret selves, our characters. It's a strange tie between reader and writer. We come to know a lasting poet or dramatist or novelist more intimately than we do people in our own time and place, closer in a way than love and friendship. We are alerted to a strain in human nature which could challenge the mess the dominant group has made of our world. For all 5 of the women I'm writing about, imagine a future where women will not replicate power. There has been growing in the shade an alternative. Virginia Woolf knows how easily her sex can be seduced by power. She persuades us to look instead at life on an ordinary day. I'm quoting from her essay, Modern Fiction. It might be a mother reading to her child, as in To the Lighthouse, or a woman preserving domestic order during the 15th century Wars of the Roses, while thugs rampage outside her walls. The thugs will come to be what is now called history, and the woman, part of the Virginia Woolf's point in the story is that her heroine, a modern day historian, can't find material about women in the 15th century. I'm referring to a story called The Journal of Mistress Joan Martin, a wonderful story which Virginia Woolf wrote very young, in about 1906. She would have been about 24, and it was not published in her lifetime. That's Mary Shelley, a very young Mary Shelley. Brutal force has hitherto governed the world, Mary Wollstonecraft, her mother, had declared in The Rights of Woman. Man accustomed to bow down to power in his savage state can seldom divest himself of this barbarous prejudice. Her daughter, Mary Shelley, echoes the word barbarous in the journal she shared with Shelley as they made their way through France in the wake of Napoleon's defeat in 1814. Nothing, she said, could be more entire than the ruin which these barbarians, that is the Cossacks, had spread as they advanced. They met a man whose 2 children the Cossacks had murdered. Here is one precedent for Mary Shelley's monster who murders Frankenstein's 5-year-old brother. As a hater, the monster is not, alas, an aberration, as he's often shown, more an enlarged embodiment of what goes wrong in our species. Violence, self-pity, too blinkered to imagine what the life furled in others means to them. Like Mary Shelley, the novelist Olive Schreiner witnessed war close at hand. I just want to interpolate that this is actually a picture of her in the early 1880s. I don't know if any of you remember the movie My Brilliant Career. Her career is very similar to Sibylla's. The movie ends, if you remember, with Sibylla posting her manuscript from Australia to London, and the sun's rising for her. And Olive Schreiner in South Africa brought by ship, that is 2 weeks by sea, brought the manuscript of A Story of an African Farm with her to London. She came from a hot place and she was walking through the rain in London with her manuscript under her raincoat, trudging from one publisher to another. It was eventually accepted and published in 1883. As I said, to enormous acclaim. It was made her name, and it was a bestseller. 20 years later, she became very well known as a new woman, a rising feminist, and also as a pacifist. And she abhorred the Anglo-Boer War, which broke out in 1899 in South Africa, where the imperial force wanted to grab the 2 diamond and gold rich Boer republics. In 1901, during the Boer War, which lasted until 1902, she was suspected of helping the Boers resist the imperial force, and to silence her, because everything she said was reported abroad. To silence her, she was held under martial law in a remote village. Wounded and dying British soldiers were brought in through the barbed wire. Their, quote, blue unclosed mouths made her think of baby mouths drawing life at women's breasts. Women and Labour, her pacifist book, begun then and there in March 1901, was her letter to a worldwide community of women, I'm quoting, who have in all ages produced at enormous cost the primal munition of war, that is, human bodies. Only if we shut off divisive adversarial soundbites will we conserve human bodies as, she says, women's works of art. The next 3 slides are very ugly, I'm afraid. I'm going to go over them quickly. I hardly like to look at them. This is imperialism at work, atrocities. This is the British South Africa Company, led by Cecil John Rhodes, in what is now Zimbabwe and was coming in his time to be called Rhodesia. These white men are stringing up Black men, the Shona or Ndebele peoples, who stood in the way of Rhodes's wish to bestride the whole continent of Africa, to turn Africa red for the British crown. There he is, the wicked man, now very much abhorred. And here in the next slide, Cecil Rhodes is to the right. He's being awarded the honour of an honorary degree by Oxford University. The British Army treated Olive Schreiner as an outsider in her own country. They disliked her dangerous oratory against war, which was reported, as I said. And she stayed under martial law for a long time, several years, finding herself ostracized by both sides. Another shunned woman was George Eliot from 1854 to 1859 for disregarding the legality of marriage. Such women in the 19th century were called fallen women, as you know. Mary Shelley suffered as a semi-outcast all her life for living with Shelley before they married. How did George Eliot evade this fate? This was one question I asked myself in the section on George Eliot. The fallen woman was forgivable only if she died, and did so repenting. George Eliot meant to survive. So how did she find her way back into society? In 1869, when the young Henry James arrived in London, George Eliot reigned, in his view, as the one marvel. Her low-toned confidence and the tender expression on her long, pale face. He's describing her in a letter to his mother back in America. Her long, pale face was superior, James saw, to the run of women, too many of whom took on a fashion for female helplessness. I'm quoting, like a species of feverish invalids. Fashion has swung the other way. Women now measure up to men, join their armies, lead their parties, and imitate the same self-justifying, know-all, sometimes lying, political voice. Evolving women are not imitative in this manner. An unmistakably authentic voice cuts to the quick. It might be Jane Eyre exposing a bully, "Speak, I must," or Catherine Earnshaw, the heroine of Wuthering Heights, who is at one with the outcast, "I am Heathcliff." To see such women collectively and to hear their fictional characters speaking through them is to wonder, how did each find a voice of her own during a period, the 19th century, when nice women were quiet? It was hard to be a woman novelist in the 19th century because women weren't expected to get inside the dust of the public arena, and they weren't supposed to intrude on men's public space. In the English comic opera, The Mikado, the Lord High Executioner, you'll remember, sings an aria in which he compiles a list of undesirables. One of these is the lady novelist. The singular anomaly, the lady novelist, sings the executioner. I don't think she'd be missed. I'm sure she'd not be missed. So how did women find a voice of their own? The answer seems to me to lie within the life, in the life within the life, that is, in the inner life. As Virginia Woolf put it in her diary, I must be private, secret, as anonymous and submerged as possible in order to write. In this sense, as well as literally, 5 women writers were apart from society. And as it happened, all were motherless in one way or another. With no female model to hand, they were freer to invent themselves. Common to all 5 women was the danger of staying at home, the risk of an unlived life. To Mary Shelley, the most contemptible of all lives is where none of your passions or affections is called into action. Fearlessly, she resolved, I'm quoting, to descend into the remotest caverns of my own mind and carry the torch of self-knowledge into its deepest recesses. This venture was not self-absorbed, not like the doomed Frankenstein, for she reached out with, quote, a kind of tenderness to like minds who could share her need to, quote, tear the veil of this strange world and pierce with eagle eyes beyond the sun. wonderful. That is from her journal. So she was trying to avoid an unlived life. But if there was danger at home, there was worse danger in leaving. The loss of protection, estrangement from family, as befell George Eliot, as befell Mary Shelley, who, though she was only a girl of 16, 17 when she went off with Shelley, her father cast her out. He was so bitterly ashamed. And he didn't accept her until she was a married woman. It meant a wandering existence, shifting as Mary Shelley did with Shelley. That is his bust, by the way, in front of you. This bust is in Eton College. They were wandering from place to place, and worst of all, exposure to the kind of predator who appeared to offer Olive Schreiner a life, that is, marriage. When she went to work as a governess in various places in Southern Africa at the age of 17. Reputation was a woman's most treasured security, and at some point, they all lost it, and Mary Shelley permanently. With no model at home, the five learned from books, if lucky, from an enlightened man. Mary Shelley said of her husband Shelley, his genius, far transcending mine, awakened and guided my thoughts. She always deferred to Shelley's gift, but he thought her the more original. She understood how rare it was to find such reciprocity. In the evenings, Shelley would often read aloud. It might be Coleridge's Ancient Mariner or extracts from Mary's father, Godwin, or her mother, Wollstonecraft. It's as if the pair, Shelley and Mary Shelley, made a home in these works, and no amount of cold shouldering from Mary Shelley's father could prevent their mental returns to him. Shelley wrote the preface to Frankenstein as from the author, declaring that though the monster is physically impossible, the situation is true to human nature in the same way that Paradise Lost is true. To put it sort of very reductively, human nature is flawed. Mary Shelley needed someone as supportive and confident as Shelley to make such a claim for her. And I thought I would just show you a rather appealing imaginary reconstruction of the Shelley family that is actually in the New York Public Library in the Pforzheimer collection. In the background are the three children who tragically died, and in the foreground their one surviving child, Percy Florence. On the left is George Henry Lewes. He was the partner of George Eliot. He was a leading critic of fiction, and he gave George Eliot the ascent. She didn't actually start writing fiction until she was 37. She was then living with Lewes. Although she was a social outcast, it was really innocent. The situation was that Lewes was married and his wife began an affair with his best friend and began to have children with this friend, and the marriage was really over. But because Lewes had recognized the children in all humanity, he didn't want them to be labeled illegitimate. The law did not allow him, once he had condoned adultery, to get a divorce. So they lived together as man and wife for the rest of their lives. He was brilliant at handling publication for George Eliot. He was a brilliant agent. He got her vast sums of money. And it was as they were planning this venture that she took the name, a man's name, George Eliot. The George was from George Henry Lewes, so she called herself his Siamese twin. They were very close. To the right, you'll recognize Leonard Wolff, Virginia and Leonard Wolff on their wedding day, the 12th of August, 1912. Leonard Wolff was the son of a Jewish barrister, Sidney Wolff, a moral being whose watchwords came from the prophet Micha in the Bible to deal justly and love mercy and walk humbly with your Lord. Leonard Wolff quite reverentially quotes this at the beginning of his autobiography to show his respect and agreement with his father. In 3 Guineas, Virginia Woolf puts, just a second, let me move on. Oh, I have here, this is Olive Schreiner, and I perhaps better not digress here to talk about her rather different marriage. She was about 37, 38 when she married a farmer who was a keen reader and admirer of the African farm, but he was, perhaps I put it quite pejoratively, he was too taken with her fame. He was always very keen for her to write another world famous book and wasn't all that pleased with her turn to political oratory. In 3 Guineas, Virginia Woolf puts women's case to a lawyer, like many in the male line of her family, the Stephens. She imagines him as a rational person, but she cannot ignore what she calls a strain of Hitlerism in the hearts of men. She's quoting Lady Astor, who was the first woman to enter the British Parliament. Frankenstein comes into his full character as the mirror of his killer monster. When he tears apart a female in the making, he's making a mate for the monster at the monster's request. And he decides not to go on with this work because he's afraid that the progeny of the monster and the mate would take over the world. Mary Shelley had a baby gestating inside her as she completed the novel Frankenstein, and she compels us to gaze at an unfinished being as its life is taken from it. So this is a quote from Frankenstein. "The remains of the half-finished creature whom I had destroyed lay scattered on the floor, and I almost felt as if I had mangled the living flesh of a human being." Like Mary Shelley, Emily Bronte treats violence face on. I've pictured here a scene of potential violence from Wuthering Heights, where in the second generation, Catherine Earnshaw, the heroine's daughter, Cathy, comes to Wuthering Heights and she encounters the brutalized men in what is an almost all-male household. We hear the hate speech that Heathcliff spews at all comers to Wuthering Heights, including his wife, Isabella, a very refined woman, Isabella Linton. When he knifes her in the neck, she is forced to run away at a time when to do so was against the law. Wuthering Heights, published in 1847, and Anne Bronte's Tenant of Wildfell Hall, her second novel, published in 1848, both present horrific scenes of domestic violence. Victorian readers did not want to know about this. They turned away from so grim a portrait of marriage in a period when marriage was idealized. Contemporary opinion and reviews vilified the sisters' novels for what was thought to be unnatural, that is, unwomanly, brutality. The counter to hate speech was the spirit of love in Dinah Morris' Preaching on the Green, and the startling eloquence of Lyndall, the new woman misfit on the veldt, in Olive Schreiner's novel of 1883, The Story of an African Farm. Novels of my 5 bring to the fore the nuanced character of what Mary Wollstonecraft calls tenderness, that was her watchword, and George Eliot calls sympathy. You hear that word resonating again and again in her work. And I wanted to interpolate here that this book, Outsiders, is dedicated to a New Yorker, to Paula Dietz, who spoke this evening, because it seemed to me that she is exemplifying in her character the future that all these women were hoping to bring about. They saw tenderness and sympathy in the civilized of both sexes. Virginia Woolf derided strutting victors. She refused public honors because she said it is an utterly corrupt society. Honorary degrees she called mere baubles of the brain-selling trade. And above all, she rejects violence. When Virginia Woolf recovered from her bout of what she called madness in 1915, she woke to the public madness of trench warfare. Soon after the last nurse left in November 1915, she wrote on the 23rd of January 1916, that's before the disastrous Battle of the Somme. She wrote to Margaret Llewellyn Davies, who ran the women's cooperative movement, "I become steadily more feminist, owing to the Times, which I read at breakfast, and wonder how this preposterous masculine fiction, that is war, keeps going a day longer. Do you see any sense in it?" Outsiders ends with the boldness of her treatise, 3 Guineas, with its an idea for an outsider society. And behind that treatise lies her mother. That is Julia Stephen, who was a volunteer nurse. And her Quaker aunt, Caroline Amelia Stephen, she was a convert to the Quakers. She became a Quaker theologian. And Virginia Woolf lived with her for a time in 1904 when she had had a breakdown. And her aunt's care for the inner voice was very healing. And she also, I believe, would have spoken about pacifism to her young niece, then Virginia Stephen. Caroline Stephen had established a women's refuge in the 1870s and had been amongst the 104 signatories to a growing women's movement that had as many as 42,000 by 1914, as against the 50,000 suffragettes. This movement was against the suffragettes because they wanted more than the vote. And included in it were Octavia Hill, who was the founder of the National Trust in England, and Elizabeth Wordsworth, the first principal of Lady Margaret Hall, the first women's college in Oxford. The reforming or so-called forward members of this movement demanded more radical change than the vote. They looked on the British Parliament as an alien debating club concerned with army, navy, mines, and railways. So I'm suggesting that it's good to look at Virginia Woolf's female kin in the generation. We see her as an advanced woman, but she actually looked back to the generation before her own, to the women in it, who abjured the copycat aims of the suffragettes. They saw women's potential contribution, along with that of civilized men, was to develop altruism and morality to counter public power resting on force. They deplored the kind of woman who craves power and imitates forceful men. Back in her early 20s, there's Virginia Woolf in her 20s, painted by her sister Vanessa Bell, and there was more than one faceless portrait. You can see by the body it's Virginia Woolf, but I think the facelessness is interesting. I don't want to digress about that now. Back in her early 20s, as I said, Virginia Stephen, as she was then, stayed several months with her Quaker aunt, who proposed the disuse of power. I like that phrase, disuse of power. And she proposed also a third House of Parliament. This was to be a consultative chamber of wise, experienced women elected by women who would bring to bear domestic traditions of preservation, nurture, sympathy, compromise, listening, values which the civilized of both sexes already share. And this would be an alternative to the adversarial world that men and women set up, in men and women in power. For the first time, Miss Stevens wrote, this is Virginia Woolf's aunt, she wrote an essay in 1909, which was published. She said, if we subscribe to the disuse of power and a third House of Parliament, we should hear a really feminine voice in national affairs, a voice that the suffrage could never give. What she predicted did in fact happen when women finally got the vote. Their voice was dissipated in the established political parties, as it still is. In 3 Guineas, Virginia Woolf summoned that voice through her Outsiders Society. Her insistence on a society implies ties. She turns from the isolated outsider and proposes instead a common cause. At the prospect, she reeled, she tells us, like a top on her afternoon walk across the Sussex Downs, for she had conceived the right to vote not for one party or another, but against the whole edifice of power. At this moment, she felt herself, she says, enfranchised till death and free of all humbug. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was brilliant and inspiring. And I'm sure
Yes.
I speak for many present in saying that I'm sure many people are eager both to read Outsiders if they haven't yet. And I'm going to pop the link for our bookstore in the chat again, just in case you'd like it. And also to read lots of things by the authors that you've mentioned. So I think that's excellent on all fronts. We do have a couple of questions here. And I encourage those with us to add your questions in the chat, and I will read them aloud to our speaker. Question here, person mentions, I am reading Outcasts now and enjoying it very much. This is lovely. Did you consider any other women writers for your book, or have you thought of anyone else since?
Yes, the one who really belongs in this group is Emily Dickinson. If anyone was an outsider, she placed herself there. But because I'd written on Emily Dickinson before, Lives Like Loaded Guns, I wanted to write freshly about others, but I would have very much liked to see Emily Dickinson as part of this group. And also, especially her separation of the outer world and her insistence on the importance of the inner life, which I felt that even as she pushes words apart with her famous dashes, she's almost making a space for an unspoken language that she communicates to us. I feel it particularly in one of my favorite poems, I tie my hat, I crease my shawl. Life's little duties do, though the very least were infinite to me. I mean, she starts the poem with all her trivial daily duties, which she is fulfilling, putting new flowers in the glass and throwing the old away. But then comes almost a volcanic explosion of dashes with a line, but yet existence, capital E, but yet existence some way back struck my ticking through. I seem to be a just marvelous, thrilling line, which invites one into the spaces of the inner life and
That's
the
fantastic.
illumination
Thank
she
you.
had there.
What is your opinion of the portrayal of Virginia Woolf in the film The Hours? And I might toss in here, do you feel like there are any very good adaptations from these writers that are worth checking out?
But I want to say straight away, I hated The Hours. I hated the portrait of Virginia Woolf. I thought it was completely wrong to begin with, first she was sort of grumpy. It was a man's view of a sort of grumpy, successful woman writer. And they made her marriage seem more fractious. I don't think it was fractious at all. So I felt it was terribly distorted, and I especially hated the beginning with its emphasis on suicide, as though that's the important thing about that life. I mean, we've come such a long way since people were in the 20th century, saw Virginia Woolf as the invalid lady of Bloomsbury moving towards suicide. I mean, since women's liberation, which was my generation, I was at Columbia as a student in 1970 when it broke up there. And I mean, the feeling was very strongly for a room of one's own, for women's empowerment, for, in the good sense, that women should have equal rights. And the strong voices that were coming out then. It was a time where Virginia Woolf came out of the shadows. She was somewhat in eclipse for about 3 decades after her death, and she was embraced. And I think you'd be glad to think of the fact that it was during the Vietnam War and during women's liberation that I think Virginia Woolf's stature rose enormously in America, and that was the reason that Leonard Wolff gave her manuscripts to the New York Public Library. So I read, as I've said, I hated the hours, and it made Virginia Woolf so grumpy. And I think I wanted to say that in her diary she said she experienced more happiness than 90% of people. You asked me about other adaptations of. Well, I've seen many adaptations of novels. I haven't seen a great adaptation of Wuthering Heights, I may say. So I could speak against the famous one by William Wyler of 1939 with Laurence Olivier and Merle Oberon. I remember while I was a student at Columbia, when I was in my 20s and living in New York, I set the alarm for 4 in the morning to see the Late Late movie because it was coming on, and I was full of expectation. And I haven't forgotten my disappointment at that. I felt Laurence Olivier was miscast as Heathcliff, but I thought it was deplorable that the film omitted the second generation. It seemed to me that the novel has to move from the wildness of Heathcliff and Catherine Earnshaw, and after their deaths, that wildness is walking the moors, to the domestic affections of the second generation, which is something one can live with. Anyway, having said that, I did like the BBC production of Middlemarch. I'm trying to think. I haven't seen any film version of the story of an African farm, and I haven't seen any film of Frankenstein.
Yeah.
So sorry to say, I don't know if any of you have, and that you would recommend one. I'm very happy to, if anyone would like to. It's an interesting question, and we all have our own opinions about these films. I don't know if anyone wants to come on and
yes, do feel free to add those in the chat,
audience
members, if you would like to. Thank you. An attendee asks, can you tell us more about Olive Schreiner's education, noting, and I would agree with this, she isn't as well known in the US as your other subjects.
Of course, she's not as well. She's a little known in England, but not very well known. She was somebody who was very famous in her lifetime, and is again in eclipse. I think she will come back. And the moment she's in eclipse in South Africa because of her skin color. I mean, I've tried to talk about her as a feminist, but this is not a time when a white woman is being welcomed as famous. But I'm very happy to talk about Olive Schreiner. She had no formal education, none at all. She was in fact quite bitter about it. Virginia Woolf was in a somewhat similar position in that she wasn't sent to school and university as her brothers were, and she was mopping up Greek in her room on her own as a young woman. But this is very much the answer of Olive Schreiner. She read prodigiously on her own. Her brothers, the family was indigent. They were desperately poor. Her father was a German missionary to South Africa. Her mother was English. Her mother had been educated, and I think her mother taught her to read. But her father lost his job as a missionary, and there was no money, but they did somehow, perhaps with family help, manage to send their sons to good schools and to Cambridge, England. But Olive Schreiner said, I'm quoting her, not a sixpence was spent on my education. Nevertheless, she was prodigiously well read. She tended not to read fiction, and George Eliot was an exception. She revered George Eliot. And I think that many late 19th century women, and here I'm thinking of Emily Dickinson too, and her sister-in-law Susan Dickinson, revered, made almost a cult of The Mill on the Floss, the 1860 novel of George Eliot. They learned a lot from that novel about the needs of brainy women, where in the 1860s there seemed, well, certainly for English women or South African women, nowhere to go. Emily Dickinson was, of course, an exception because she lived only 9 miles from Mount Holyoke, and she did go there for a year. And she had a very enlightened father who saw that she was a very gifted young woman.
We've got in the chat a couple of shout outs. The PBS production of Daniel Deronda, which I haven't seen but need to look up.
Sorry, I forgot that. I must say that was superb. I hope who am I speaking to? Susan Apple. Well, thank you for bringing that up, Susan Apple.
Excellent. And the National Theatre's production of Frankenstein, which had Benedict Cumberbatch and Johnny Lee Miller. I think that's been a favorite of a lot of people. So, yeah. So question, do the views of today's university students in England of these authors differ from in the 1970s?
Oh, that's a good question. I was teaching full time in the well, in the 80s and the 70s. I was teaching around the university, and so teaching quite a lot, and into the 90s. And I think that in the 80s, I do remember my students wanting to take George Eliot off because they felt she was too accommodating to domesticity. They felt that, I don't know how it strikes you now. I think now there would be a fuller understanding of what I was trying to put over in the talk, that there are very great things in the domestic order that we need to recuperate for civilization: nurture, listening, compromise, and kindness. And I'm not saying that men don't have such traditions too. I think that, as I was saying, these qualities are in the civilized of both sexes. But George Eliot did have a strong feeling for domesticity. And I think the women of the 80s with you remember the clothes we wore then with big padded shoulders, imitating men, office outfits. It wasn't here anyway in Oxford. It was a decade where women wanted to sort of put domesticity to one side and go out and enter the big world. I don't know how things. I'm not teaching at the moment, and I'm not aware of exactly what young women
That's
feel
fascinating
right now.
So we have a question about Mary Shelley's black dress, which you mentioned in the book.
Yes, Paula Dietz mentioned that to me. Yes, I think it's in the journal she kept with Shelley. They had a combined journal when they first went off together, and they were sort of really walking through France from Paris to Switzerland. I mean, they had some decrepit animals they bought completely by mistake. They had absolutely no judgment. They brought an ass on its last legs and donkey on its last legs. So I think they did a lot of walking, and I found it quite sweet and surprising that Mary Godwin and her stepsister Claire Clement, who was with them, had black silk dresses, which doesn't seem to us quite the outfit for a long trudge.
But a sort of backwards
anyway,
and in heels quality to that, perhaps.
They were only, well, Mary Shelley was only 16 going on 17, and Claire Clement was about a year younger. They were very young, and perhaps enjoyed dressing up and feeling adults, that they were out in the world, yes. But that they were soon disillusioned because France was a mess at that time, and they were staying in inns that were, the people were depressed, and the inns were filthy and full, and beds full of bugs, and there was no running water. I mean, they you know, I think that I don't know how long they wore those black silk dresses.
Thank you. So I think we'll move toward closing questions in just a moment. If anybody's got anything else they'd like to add, please do so in the chat at this point. And I do just want to ask you if you'd like to tell us about what's coming up next for you. What's the current project? What can we look forward to?
Yes, I'm in the middle of writing a book called provisionally Eliot Among the Women. This is T.S. Eliot. I'm writing something completely fresh and different from the biography, The Imperfect Life of T.S. Eliot, which Norton publishes. Norton is going to publish this book I'm writing now in 2022 at the time of the centenary of the Wasteland. The title, the provisional title, is a play on Eliot's alternative title for his first great poem, Prufrock Among the Women. And I'm going to look now, with a lot of new material that's available to us, at 4 women in Eliot's life. His mother, his first wife, Vivian Haywood, his great love, his first love, who became a long-term love affair in his middle years, Emily Hale, and finally his second wife. Or I will also bring in another woman, Mary Trevelyan, but I won't talk about that now. The main figure in this book is Emily Hale, because, as you probably know, 1,131 letters from Eliot to Emily Hale, which have been embargoed for 50 years, were released on the 2nd of January this year. And I, together with a few others, were at Princeton when the archives were opened that day. And it was very fortunate in retrospect that I was able to read those letters in January and February, because, of course, the library, the archives anyway, have been closed.
Yes,
March.
We can all be glad that you got to that trove and that had been opened at that time. Excitement for a biographer, by all means. Excellent. Thank you so much. And thank you, Lyndall Gordon. Thank you, our introducer, Paula Dietz. Thank you, everyone who has joined us this afternoon. It's been an absolute pleasure. And I think we will close there. Do join us for upcoming events.
Thank you. And thank you for having me.